side, I'm assuming your bus tour guides pointed out Hatzor or Hazor. You saw that, yes? That's a very important site. Probably it was the largest city in northern Israel. In the Bible, Hatzor is called the head of all those kingdoms. It was a major Canaanite site, actually. But later on, eventually, the Israelites during the conquest took Hatzor. And it went back and forth between Canaanites and Israelites. There's a famous story of Jabin who gets a nail in the temple, you know. And later on, that would become a King Solomon district capital, Hatzor, because it was so important. And I'm interested in that because Yadil Yadin, who dug at Hatzor in the 50s, found a Solomonic gateway, a fortified gate with 6 chambers in it. And he remembered that a similar gate had been found at Megiddo. And we're going to see Megiddo later. And then one had been, he predicted one would be found at Gezer, and I was working at Gezer. And we do have a 6-chamber gate built for King Solomon there too. We'll talk about that later, but I'm just mentioning it because we happen to come by the area. Now that we're here, I'll tell you a little bit of why I'm interested in this site. This is the first time I've been back since I wrote a chapter for a book that was just published before we came on this trip by Baylor University at the end of last year, like November, December. It's called The Old Testament in Archaeology and History. And it was the first attempt to actually see what role archaeology and history plays in exegesis. Now, it was not written by Adventists except me. It was written by a team of about 20 scholars from all over the place, so it's a bit historical critical. In other words, I don't agree with all the chapters and the things they say, but they are trying to integrate archaeology with the Bible. And if you get that book, and you go down to chapter 14, you'll see it's entitled Israel, the Prosperous Northern Kingdom. And some guy named Randy Younker wrote that chapter. And so because of my work on that, I've been very interested. The prosperous northern kingdom was basically established here. And if you know the story in the Bible, and I'll give a brief synopsis, King Solomon had become quite wealthy. He had a rather turbulent life. He had his spiritual ups and downs. And towards the end of his life, he was a great builder. You remember when the Israelites went to the prophet Samuel and they said, we would like a king like everybody else. And Samuel basically said in the Younker paraphrased version, be careful what you ask for, you might get it. In other words, your sons will be put into corvée, which means working for the king, and you'll have to pay taxes. And basically, by the time Solomon comes around, becomes very wealthy. His empire, according to the Bible, seems to reach its greatest extent. And to support that kingdom, he was charging pretty high taxes. Most of his population of the kingdom of Israel, Solomon's kingdom of Israel, lived in the north. The Israelites, they guesstimate, we don't know for sure, about 800,000 people lived in the Israelite area, about 200,000 in the southern part of Judea, which included Jerusalem. So Solomon was down there, but he had all these building projects, and so he was taxing the people very hard, very heavily. There was one worker for King Solomon. He was an administrator. He was from the north, and his name was Jeroboam. And he heard, since he was a northerner, he heard all of his northern compatriots who were being forced to work for King Solomon. They were complaining. We're having to work too much. We're too much away from our families. We're having to pay too high of taxes. And so Jeroboam, feeling sympathy for his fellow northerners, went to King Solomon's officials. He said, hey, you need to lighten up. You need to back off a little bit. The people are getting very upset. Unfortunately, like in so many administrations, they basically said, just shut up and do what you're told. And Rehoboam didn't like that very much, and so he started fermenting a bit of a rebellion. We're not going to take it anymore. And you can kind of feel a little bit of sympathy for him, perhaps. And so ultimately what happened, his name got on a list. You're no longer an officer, and they wanted to arrest him or do something bad to him. And so he left the northern kingdom of Solomon's Israel, took off for Egypt, where he met a pharaoh by the name of Shishak, or Shishak in the Bible. Okay, Shishak, Shishak, Shishak. His name in Egyptian is Shishonk. Okay, and he was a real person. We actually know him archaeologically. It's one of those special correlations between the Bible and archaeology. And so Shishak, who saw Solomon, has a bit of competition. And by the way, the Gezer story, Shishak actually conquered Gezer. And Solomon said, this is at the beginning of Solomon's reign. And the Egyptian pharaoh said, well, I was just testing you, why don't you make an alliance with me and marry my daughter? And that's kind of what happened. So anyway, Shishak was around a long time, kind of looking with envy at Solomon's kingdom. So when Solomon died, Shishak thought this is another opportunity maybe to move in. And he had this officer, a disgruntled officer from Solomon's administration from the north named Jeroboam, and he was down there in Egypt. So Jeroboam asked Shishak, can I come back north? I would like to start a rebellion. And this was music to Shishak's ears, because he thought maybe in the course of the disruption, I can cut off a piece of Solomon's great kingdom and enhance the riches and the glory of Egypt. And so Shishak allows him to come back. And when he gets here, he has a lot of friends. There's a lot of sympathy. They remembered that he was on their side against the taxes and the corvée, the manual labor of King Solomon. There was a new king in Jerusalem. His name was Rehoboam. I always thought this was done by God on purpose to help little kids with their memory. Jeroboam, Rehoboam rhymes. And I always thought that was convenient. But anyway, Rehoboam was a young king, and so the northerners sent a delegation down to Rehoboam and said, your dad was a little bit tough on us, and people are getting unhappy. What about backing off the taxes and backing off the corvée and stuff like that? Rehoboam was a young king, and the older guys that surrounded him and had worked for his father said, it was getting pretty bad. Maybe, young man, young king, be a good idea that you listen to the complaints of the northerners. But like so many young kings, he also surrounded himself with a bunch of contemporary young hot shots, and they enjoyed being in power, and they didn't want to give anything up that Daddy Solomon had gotten. And so they said, no, don't listen to the old man. Let's go ahead and in fact, if anything, let's raise the taxes more. Bad move. And so the 10 tribes of Israel north of Jerusalem, they basically came back and said, Rehoboam turned down our offer. They were not happy, and since Jeroboam was already recognized as an administrative leader, had been down to Egypt and everything, they basically said, we're going to succeed from the Union. And so you have the North succeeding from the South in this case, as opposed to what happened in the United States. And so they start this big rebellion here. And now, one of the things, there were some people in Israel who said, wait a minute, we're not really happy about a rebellion, just like the United States. You really want to do this, And so to make sure everybody was on board, Jeroboam wanted to repeat or duplicate the major attraction to the southern kingdom of Israel, which was in Jerusalem, the temple, not only of Solomon. Solomon had made it greater, but, the tabernacle and the temple were there. That was their access to God. And that was very important to all of Israel by that time. That was their rally point. And so Jeroboam knew he had to replace that. And so what he did was built a rival temple. It wasn't quite as glorious as Solomon's, but it would do in a pinch. And so you're sitting on the steps right now that enter up into the platform of that worship place that Jeroboam built. It was basically, in my opinion, scholars argue about this, but it was a rival temple. So these are the steps up. And by the way, that's why they often call it a bama, or a high place, is because you always go up to encounter God. And so behind you is the holy place of Jeroboam's temple. Now in front of the temple in Jerusalem, what did you have? You had a big altar, and the archaeologists found this wonderful Iron Age altar that dates to this is actually a grave that they found. It would have been made out of special kind of stone. And this is about the correct size. They can tell because of the platform for the altar below. The one in Jerusalem was also very large. It's not just like a little thing you put your lamb on. This was a serious kind of a sacrificial location. There might have even been steps that went up to it, and that's where they would have the sacrifice. And you hear about the calves. He had to have an alternate kind of a worship thing, so they switched the attention from Yahweh to these special cows, sacred cows. Now, some scholars like to say, well, that was the beginning of the story of Moses and the false cows at the Sinai. That's one critical approach. I tend to be more historical and believe that he was basically bringing in some new ideas. Baal was very popular up here, and he was trying to introduce something that would rival Yahwehism and compete with it, but still be a little bit different to help them make a distinct identity as a northern people. So he's kind of keeping a little bit and adding some new stuff. And so here you see the famous rival sanctuary that was found by the archaeologists. This was dug by the Israeli archaeologists over a number of years. The famous Abraham Beiron, or Aviram in Hebrew, Bayron was the director of this excavation. They found many other things here at this site as well, but this is one of their wonderful discoveries. This is what I wish I would find, or would like to find, over in my site in Jordan, where the Israelites also were located. So this was really sort of like Magdalene, what was it, yesterday?
That's right.
Time all kind of runs together. But that was a real treasure find. You got something connected with biblical history. Here they found something connected with biblical history. So a very special find. You can see the typical way the stones are cut, showing extra expense, extra time. These are hewn stones laid out very, very nicely. The other thing I want to share with you quickly while we're at the site, two other things that were found. If you go that direction, there's the gate. Some of us saw it as we drove in on the bus. That's actually a later gate from the divided monarchy, a little later than Rehoboam I. And it's been modified a couple times. You see a wonderful city wall. There's an outer gate and an inner gate. Here's the story. A few years ago, I was in Chicago, and the minimalists, a group of biblical scholars that say there's not much in the Bible that's historical at all, anything from Genesis all the way down to Queen Esther, most of it was made up in the late Persian or post-Persian period. So the Bible's basically concocted fraud made up of made-up stories. And one of their illustrations, I was sitting at the meeting actually in Chicago, as I recall, and they were saying King David was no more historical a personage than King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, or he's no more historical than Jack and the Beanstalk. That was literally what was said. You know, you just need to get over that. And there was a big argument about that, of course, but this was the minimalist school. It was not too long after that presentation in Chicago that Avraham Bayron's team was working over in the gate area, and he had an architect who was drawing all these buildings. Her name was Robin Cook. You can see a film that tells the story from her perspective. And she was finishing up her drawings, and Avraham Bayron shouted at her and her assistant, "Come on, the team's leaving. We got to go back to camp. The day is done." And she ignored him because she was finishing her drawings. And so he calls again, "Come on, Rob, it's time to go." So she starts walking down to the gate area, which had already been excavated. And she's sitting down. It's late afternoon. The sun's at an oblique angle, and she's looking at one of the flat stones in the wall. These are kind of flat stones, and she's looking at the stone. The angle of the sun was hitting it just right. Hundreds of people had walked by for who knows how many countless days on the excavation. They hadn't seen it, but she saw some faint writing appearing on this flat stone. She got all excited, and she called Bayron, "Get up here, you got to see this." It turned out to be a victory stela from a Syrian king, probably Hazael, who is mentioned in the Bible, and he's bragging about how he conquered the king of Israel. It's actually in the inscription in Hebrew, and he says, "I conquered the Beit David," the house of David. And there was David's name right there. Well, you can imagine how the minimalists felt. They were very upset about this. They had just announced to the world that David didn't exist, and here this wise guy Bayron is finding his name on an inscription, you know, of all the nerve. And so what they try to do is what scholars often do when you have a pet theory that's inconvenienced by the facts, you try and re-explain the facts. And so they looked at those letters in Hebrew, which is DVD, David. But in Hebrew, the V, if you guys have taken a little Hebrew from the seminary, can also be an O or a U vowel sound in some context. And they said, no, it's not David or David, it's an O, so it's Dode. You know, it's the house of the Dode, you know. Or it could be house of the dude. That's what it is, house of the dude. What those would translate into in Hebrew would be the house of the uncle or the house of the kettle, like a pot for making your Sabbath lentils. Well, most of the other linguists and the archaeologists kind of said, you got to be kidding. You know, this is clearly the house of David. Get over it. You know, David exists. And so basically most scholars that I'm aware of would accept the fact that we have a historical reference found here at Tel Dan to King David himself. It wasn't David, it was his successor, the house of David. But the Syrians are bragging. This was written about 840 BC, about 100 years after Solomon and David, and they're bragging about beating the house of David. They were very happy about that. It didn't last long because the Israelites came back, knocked the victory stele down, and stuck it in the wall where they didn't think anybody would find it, and they didn't find it until just a few years ago. So that's the other major discovery. And the third thing, and we'll be leaving that way, you see that piece of delicate archaeological equipment? It's rusty. Okay? You have to be specially trained to use that. It's just for moving dirt. You're not supposed to use them really on a dig, but we used it once at Gezer to remove some debris from a dig from 100 years. We didn't feel like spending $20,000 to go through another archaeologist's dirt pile. So we did bring a tractor there, and I got Deaver to take a picture because he was the one always condemning, never use a tractor on your dig students. I was one of his students. I got him in the tractor, took his picture. Then I threatened to blackmail him by selling it to Biblical Archaeology Review magazine. That's how I got my PhD. Really joking. So we're going to head that direction. We're following Nelson and our team over here, and they're going to show us where there's an old early bronze gate. This city was called Laish in the Bible before. Laish. It changed names when the Danites were here, and I wish I could tell you more about Dan, but there's a gateway that dates possibly the time of Abraham. He may have entered through that gate because the Bible says that Abraham chased the kidnappers of Lot all the way to the gates of Laish. So that may be the gate that dates to the right period. Question?
Never heard about that.
This is what, 1800 years before Christ?
Yeah. Well, it would be in the 10th century to the 9th century, yeah.